All right, so in this video, what we're going to have is Piers Morgan and Stephen C. Myers piggybacking off of a conversation that Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan are having. It's going to be very interesting, and at the end, I'm going to give some of my comments and thoughts, and even adding some more important things that were already being discussed. With that being said, let's dig into it.
If evolution is real, and if there is this constant, I don't know, but it's visible. Like you can measure it in certain animals.
You can measure adaptation.
Yeah.
But there's no evidence that in fact, I think we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution. The theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin is like kind of not true. Right?
In what sense?
Well, in the most basic sense, the idea that, all life emerged from a single cell organism and over time, and there would be a fossil record of that, and there's not.
Your response?
Well, I don't know what Tucker knows about all this, but
probably not as qualified as you. But he likes to.
It would start with something that happened here in London a few years ago, 2016. A major conference convened by the Royal Society, arguably the world's most august and prestigious scientific body, was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who are dissatisfied with the standard neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. And many of the conveners are calling for a new theory because the primary mechanism of biological change articulated by Darwin and his subsequent followers, now called the neo-Darwinists, the idea of natural selection acting on random mutations and variations, is now understood to lack the creative power to generate major changes in the history of life.
And is at the crux of this debate, is it, as Tucker was getting at there, is it that if you actually start from where Darwin's theory begins, the creation of the human being was so complicated, the body, the way we exist is so complicated, it doesn't make any rational sense.
There's two issues, really. There's how do you get to the first life from the simpler non-living chemicals? That's sometimes called chemical evolutionary theory, and that's a complete mess. It's in a state of impasse, and almost everyone, even your recent guest, Richard Dawkins, acknowledges we have no chemical evolutionary theory that accounts for the origin of the first life. And many people don't know that Darwin didn't attempt to explain the origin of the first life. Rather, he presumed one or very few simple organisms, which we now know were not simple, and then proposed a mechanism by which you could generate all the new forms of life we see on the planet today. But even that now is being challenged because the main mechanism of evolutionary change does a nice job of explaining small-scale variation. What Tucker was referring to, I think, is adaptation. This would be examples like Darwin's finches, where the beaks get a little bigger, a little smaller in response to varying weather patterns. But it does a very poor job of explaining the major innovations in the history of life, such as the origin of birds or mammals or animals in the first place. And there in the fossil record, we do see very abrupt, many instances of very abrupt appearance without the transitional intermediates that you'd expect on the basis of the Darwinian picture of the tree of life. So
is your belief that the Darwin theory actually fails then?
I think it does fail. I think it captures an element of the truth. There's the small-scale microevolutionary variation is certainly a real process, and no one disputes that. Natural selection is a real process, but what's at issue now is the degree to which it has genuine creative power. And I think at this 2016 conference, the opening talk was given by a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, not an American talk show host, and he enumerated 5 major explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism, many of them surrounding this problem that the mechanism lacks the generative or creative power necessary to account for the major innovations in the history of life.
Well, your best-selling book, new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, you argue there are 3 big scientific discoveries that point to the existence of God. I want to go through these. One, the Big Bang Theory. So why would that lend support to a theory of a God? Or God?
Well, right. Maybe just a little framing before I dive into the evidence. Professor Dawkins at Oxford has said that the universe has precisely the properties that we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And though I'm on the opposite side of this science v. God issue with the good professor, I think he does a marvelous job of framing key issues. And this is one of those great framing quotations. Because what he's saying is that whether we think of it as a scientific question or a philosophical question or both, if we have a hypothesis about reality, the way we test that is by looking at the world around us and seeing if what we see comports with what we would expect to see if our hypothesis were true. And his hypothesis is that of blind, pitiless indifference, which is a shorthand way of saying that everything came about by strictly undirected material processes. And what the materialists expected coming into the early 20th century was evidence of an eternal, self-existent universe, one that had been here for an infinitely long time and therefore did not need an external creator. What in fact the astrophysicists, the cosmologists, the astronomers found was evidence of a universe that had a definite beginning, and therefore one that could not have created itself, because before the matter of the universe came into existence, there was no matter there to do the causing. And so the picture of the universe that has emerged starting from the 1920s all the way to the present, both from observational astronomy and from theoretical physics, is a universe that had a definite beginning and therefore requires some sort of external creator or cause.
Dawkins is obviously one of the world's most famous atheists. Are you a believer in God yourself?
I do believe in God, yes.
Okay, so let's play a clip from Dawkins on this show. So
Yes.
why is it not possible that there is a superior being, power, which many people believe in different
It's
ways?
possible there are
different
fairies
types
at the
of
bottom
God.
of the garden. I mean, all sorts of things are possible. and you can't deny that.
Well, except I've never seen fairies in the garden, have you?
No, you've never seen God either.
No, but you don't know for sure that either doesn't exist.
No, I don't know that fairies don't exist. Fairies may well, there may be leprechauns, for all I know.
You know, my big question for all atheists, is, okay, you don't believe in God, but what was there before the Big Bang, before this all started? In other words, what was there before supposedly nothing? What is nothing? Nothing to me seems to be a totally incongruous word. What is nothingness? And if you can't explain it, to me, and I believe in God, but to me, it suggests there must be a power bigger than the human mind at the start of all this that was able to comprehend what may have happened, because we can't.
Right. Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case. And that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest. And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes the traditional theists have traditionally associated with God. God is a timeless, God is outside of time and space, has causal powers, is an agent with volition, and therefore can initiate a change of state from, in this case, nothing to something.
And do you believe that God created this original single cell from which everything flows to us?
Oh, the single cell as opposed to the universe.
Well, I guess you go back to the universe,
and
then you go back to the creation of a single cell that has this incredible complexity that eventually, through the process of evolution, leads to human beings.
Yeah, I do think there's...
Do you believe that's really the most likely scenario?
Yeah, I do think there's incredible evidence of intelligent design at the point of the origin of life, because that first simple cell, in the 19th century, Thomas Huxley said that the cell is a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm.
Brilliant phrase.
Wonderful. He was one of the great scientists of the 19th century, but we know so much more now that he didn't know. And what we now know is that inside even the simplest cell, we have digital nanotechnology. We have the information stored in the DNA. We have an exquisite system of information storage, transmission, and processing. And that information is being used to build protein machines and other even more complex nanomachinery inside the cell. So it's a sort of automated factory run by digital information. People didn't know about that in the early 19th century.
But do you believe, like I said, originally there's just one single solitary cell that's created?
Well, right. Presumably, that's where...
Is that what you think?
I do think there was an original cell that was created.
Because the theory of evolution says the journey from single cell to the full complexity of life on Earth and so on happened by random trial and error. But your position, I think, is that it's so complicated, this original single cell, so complex for all the reasons you just articulated, that that's just simply not feasible, that it would be just random trial and error. It had to be the creation of some superior entity.
Right.
Is that right?
Well, again, there's two contexts. There's the how do you get to the first cell, and then how do you get from the first cell to everything else. Let's just take the origin of the first cell.
You think the creator of the universe is God?
I do.
And then out of the universe comes the creation of a single cell, which again is God.
Right. Here's the evidence, though, that when we see information in a digital or alphabetic or typographic form, and this is what we actually see in the DNA. When Francis Crick elucidated what he called the sequence hypothesis in the late 1950s, he realized that the 4 subunits along the interior of the DNA are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or digital characters in a section of software. What we know from experience is that whenever we say information of that sort, it always comes from a mind.
I believe that Tucker and Dr. Myers have a valid argument for the lack of evidence there is in evolution for it to be true in relation to the fossil record. In Stephen C. Myers' book, Return of the God Hypothesis, he speaks about this tree of evolution that he mentions in this video. And what he says is, let's flip this tree of evolution upside down. And what Dr. Myer says is that the evidence that we have within the fossil records, this is an accurate or more accurate representation of what this picture looks like that Darwin was trying to present. It flips it upside down. And what he means by that is a certain amount of biological organisms came into existence around the same time with digestive systems and functions that are not dependent on the evolution of one or the other. Meaning they didn't come in this evolutionary chain or relation as Darwinian evolution presents. And this is why Tucker Carlson said we kind of gave up on the idea of evolution in this Darwinian sense. So with that being said, you can go in, if you have Return of the God Hypothesis by Stephen C. Myers, you can find this Cambrian explosion explanation of the fossil record in his book, and just go to the table of contents, you'll be able to see where it's at. But there's more than enough evidence, and this is one, to know that we can put our trust and our faith in Jesus Christ, the creator of all things. So with that being said, I hope this video inspired you to learn more about the fossil records. I'm going to continue to dig into them and continue to learn more and challenge my brain. And with that being said, I hope you have a blessed day.